Postmodern Condition by Jean-Francois Lyotard. 10. Delegitimation. In contemporary society and culture, post-industrial society, postmodern culture, the question of the legitimation of knowledge is formulated in different terms. The grand narrative has lost its credibility, regardless of what mode of unification it uses, regardless of whether it is a speculative narrative or a narrative of emancipation. The decline of narrative can be seen as an effect of the blossoming of techniques and technologies since the Second World War, which has shifted emphasis from the ends of action to its means. It can also be seen as an effect of the redeployment of advanced liberal capitalism after its retreat under the protection of Keynesianism during the period 1930 to 60, a renewal that has eliminated the communist alternative and valorized the individual enjoyment of goods and services. Anytime we go searching for causes in this way, we are bound to be disappointed. Even if we adopted one or the other of these hypotheses, we would still have to detail the correlation between the tendencies mentioned and the decline of the unifying and legitimating power of the grand narratives of speculation and emancipation. It is, of course, understandable that both capitalist renewal and prosperity and the disorienting upsurge of technology would have an impact on the status of knowledge. But in order to understand how contemporary science could have been susceptible to those effects long before they took place, we must first locate the seeds of delegitimation and nihilism that were inherent in the grand narratives of the 19th century. First of all, the speculative apparatus maintains an ambiguous relation to knowledge. It shows that knowledge is only worthy of that name to the extent that it reduplicates itself by citing its own statements in a second-level discourse that functions to legitimate them. This is as much as to say that in its immediacy, denotative discourse bearing on a certain referent does not really know what it thinks it knows. Positive science is not a form of knowledge, and speculation feeds on its suppression. The Hegelian speculative narrative thus harbors a certain skepticism toward positive learning, as Hegel himself admits. A science that has not legitimated itself is not a true science. If the discourse that was meant to legitimate it seems to belong to a prescientific form of knowledge, like a vulgar narrative, it is demoted to the lowest rank, that of an ideology or instrument of power. And this always happens if the rules of the science game that discourse denounces as empirical are applied to science itself. Take, for example, the speculative statement. A scientific statement is knowledge if and only if it can take its place in a universal process of engendering. The question is this statement knowledge, as it itself defines it, only if it can take its place in a universal process of engendering? Which it can. All it has to do is to presuppose that such a process exists and that it is itself an expression of that process. This presupposition, in fact, is indispensable to the speculative language game. Without it, the language of legitimation would not be legitimate. It would accompany science in a nosedive into nonsense, at least if we take idealism's word for it. But this presupposition can also be understood in a totally different sense, one which takes us in the direction of postmodern culture. We could say, in keeping with the perspective we adopted earlier, that this presupposition defines the set of rules one must accept in order to play the speculative game. Such an appraisal assumes first that we accept that the positive sciences represent the general mode of knowledge, and second, that we understand this language to imply certain formal and axiomatic presuppositions that it must always make explicit. This is exactly what Nietzsche is doing, though with a different terminology, when he shows that European nihilism resulted from the truth requirement of science being turned back against itself. There thus arises an idea of perspective that is not far removed, at least in this respect, from the idea of language games. What we have here is a process of delegitimation, fueled by the demand for legitimation itself. The crisis of scientific knowledge, signs of which have been accumulating since the end of the 19th century, is not born of a chance proliferation of sciences, itself an effect of progress in technology and the expansion of capitalism. It represents rather an internal erosion of the legitimacy principle of knowledge. There's erosion at work inside the speculative game, and by loosening the weave of the encyclopedic net in which each science was to find its place, it eventually sets them free. The classical dividing lines between the various fields of science are thus called into question. Disciplines disappear, overlappings occur at the borders between sciences, and from these new territories are born. The speculative hierarchy of learning gives way to an imminent and, as it were, flat network of areas of inquiry, the respective frontiers of which are in constant flux. The old faculties splinter into institutes and foundations of all kinds, and the universities lose their function of speculative legitimation. Stripped of the responsibility for research, they limit themselves to the transmission of what is judged to be established knowledge, and through didactics, they guarantee the replication of teachers rather than the production of researchers. This is the state in which Nietzsche finds and condemns them. The potential for erosion intrinsic to the other legitimation procedure, the emancipation apparatus flowing from the Aufklärung, is no less extensive than the one at work within speculative discourse. But it touches a different aspect. Its distinguishing characteristic is that it grounds the legitimation of science and truth in the autonomy of interlocutors involved in ethical, social, and political praxis. As we have seen, there are immediate problems with this form of legitimation. The difference between a denotative statement with cognitive value and a prescriptive statement with practical value is one of relevance, therefore of competence. There's nothing to prove that if a statement describing a real situation is true, it follows that a prescriptive statement based upon it will be just. Take, for example, a closed door. Between the doors closed and open the door, there is no relation of consequence as defined in propositional logic. The two statements belong to two autonomous sets of rules defining different kinds of relevance, and therefore of competence. Here, the effect of dividing reason into cognitive or theoretical reason on the one hand, and practical reason on the other, is to attack the legitimacy of the discourse of science. Not directly, but indirectly, by revealing that it is a language game with its own rules, and that it has no special calling to supervise the game of praxis. The game of science is thus put on a par with the others. If this delegitimation is pursued in the slightest, and if its scope is widened, the road is then open for an important current of postmodernity. Science plays its own game. It is incapable of legitimating the other language games. The game of prescription, for example, escapes it. But above all, it is incapable of legitimating itself, as speculation assumed it could. The social subject itself seems to dissolve in this dissemination of language games. The social bond is linguistic, but is not woven with a single thread. It is a fabric formed by the intersection of at least two, and in reality an indeterminate number, of language games obeying different rules. Wittgenstein writes, "Our language can be seen as an ancient city, a maze of little streets and squares, of old and new houses, and of houses with additions from various periods, and this surrounded by a multitude of new boroughs, with straight regular streets and uniform houses." And to drive home that the principle of unitotality, or synthesis under the authority of a meta-discourse of knowledge, is inapplicable. He subjects the town of language to the old Sorite's paradox by asking, how many houses or streets does it take before a town begins to be a town? New languages are added to the old ones, forming suburbs of the old town. The symbolism of chemistry and the notation of the infinitesimal calculus. 35 years later, we can add to the list machine languages, the matrices of game theory, new systems of musical notation, systems of notation for non-denotative forms of logic, the language of the genetic code, graphs of phonological structures, and so on. We may form a pessimistic impression of this splintering. Nobody speaks all of those languages. They have no universal meta-language. The project of the system subject is a failure. The goal of emancipation has nothing to do with science. We are all stuck in the positivism of this or that discipline of learning. The learned scholars have turned into scientists. The diminished tasks of research have become compartmentalized, and no one can master them all. Speculative or humanistic philosophy is forced to relinquish its legitimation duties, which explains why philosophy is facing a crisis wherever it persists in arrogating such functions and is reduced to the study of systems of logic or the history of ideas where it has been realistic enough to surrender them. Turn-of-the-century Vienna was weaned on this pessimism. Not just artists such as Musil, Krauss, Hofmannsthal, Loos, Schoenberg, and Bruck, but also the philosophers Mach and Wittgenstein. They carried awareness of and theoretical and artistic responsibility for delegitimation as far as it could be taken. We can say today that the mourning process has been completed. There's no need to start all over again. Wittgenstein's strength is that he did not opt for the positivism that was being developed by the Vienna, but outlined in his investigation of language games a kind of legitimation not based on performativity. That is what the postmodern world is all about. Most people have lost the nostalgia for the lost narrative. It in no way follows that they are reduced to barbarity. What saves them from it is their knowledge that legitimation can only spring from their own linguistic practice and communicational interaction. Science, smiling into its beard at every other belief, has taught them the harsh austerity of realism.